Story 1. I live in Maine, and this happened about 3 months after I started driving for Uber. By no means is it the scariest experience I've had, but it is the strangest. To set the scene, it was a little after 10 p.m., and I was only planning to do one more drive, as I had work and school the next day. Eventually I got the notification that someone requested a ride. I'll call him Charles for the purposes of this story. He was only a few miles away, and I drove right over. As I came to his location, I started to realize how empty the place was. The GPS was taking me to some back road, and I didn't even see any houses or other buildings on it. Then I saw him in my headlights. Charles looked to be a young man, though I couldn't be sure as he had a gray hoodie on. He also had on blue sweatpants and some sneakers. As I pulled up, I took another look around and saw nothing. This was a kind of woodsy area, as there didn't seem to be any man-made structures nearby. Here he was, just standing on the side of the road. Alarm bells started going off, and I debated for a moment whether or not to pick him up. Ultimately, I decided to. I drove up to him, rolled down the passenger side window, and asked him if he was Charles, but he didn't say anything. I waited a few seconds and then repeated myself, but again, he was quiet. A moment later, I thought I heard him make a small grunting sound, which I thought could indicate a yes. I told him to open the back door and have a seat. After what seemed like a minute, I finally heard the door open extremely softly and saw him climb in. He took about 10 seconds to do so, and then he closed the door just as softly. "So, where to?" I asked. While this was after Uber started showing drivers the destination, I still wanted to confirm it. Again, Charles didn't say anything. Now, I don't usually stare at people, but I kept looking at Charles through the rearview mirror, trying to get a read on him and waiting for him to answer. He was just looking down. Maybe at a phone, but I don't know. I asked him again and still nothing. He didn't look up at me, nor answer my question. I was still sketched out and tried to decide what to do. I was afraid Charles might try to jump me right when I started the car. I did have a can of pepper spray down next to the armrest, so I could get to it quickly, and so I felt a little bit more safe. Ultimately, I just started driving to the destination, all the while glancing back and forth at Charles. It was about a 10-minute drive, and while we started to get back on some main roads, eventually the route led us onto another smaller road. Like before, there was almost nothing on either side. This time there were a few scattered houses, but mostly it was just empty fields. A few minutes later we reached the destination, which I was not surprised to see was completely empty. I brought the car to a stop and said, "We're here." Then I looked at Charles again. He said nothing, and he was still looking down, so I just waited. And 10 seconds later, he quietly opened the car door and started getting out. He shut it softly, and then walked to the side of the road. As I was putting in my home address, I realized that Charles was still just standing there. He was on the right side of the road, and he was standing just beyond the curb. He wasn't looking at me. Rather, he was standing at kind of an angle, looking off into the field. He still seemed to be looking down slightly, and I didn't see him move. I did a 3-point turn to head back the way I came, and as I did, I still didn't see him move. I started to go forward, but in the mirror I saw that Charles was still just standing there. Eventually he faded from view. Right after the ride, I didn't know what to think, though looking back I suspect Charles had some kind of mental condition. At the time I also thought he may have been on something, or maybe he had been planning to attack me but then decided against it. For whatever reason, I consider those to be less likely though. I felt bad later about just leaving him at his destination. Maybe I should have tried to get him help, or convinced him to get dropped off in a more public place, or to call somebody. However, none of these ideas occurred to me in that moment. I just hope that, whatever situation Charles was in, he's okay. Story 2. A few weeks ago, I and my 2 friends decided to call an Uber after leaving a bar at like 1 a.m. For some backstory, we had just graduated college and were all working in the same area. We had met our sophomore year, and we were pretty close. For this story, I'll call my friends Clarissa and Nikki. None of us had used Uber a lot, and no one had had a really bad experience. That is, until that night. We had all been heavily drinking, and so we were a bit out of it. We did manage to call an Uber using Nikki's account, and a few minutes later our driver showed up. His name was Gary, and from what I remember, he was a very skinny, middle-aged man, and his car had a distinctive odor to it. I don't think it was cigarette smoke, but I couldn't place my finger on it. He was definitely on the quiet side, and we almost didn't hear him when he asked us where we wanted to go. We gave him Nikki's address, and he appeared to put it in and start driving. Eventually we realized that he wasn't going the right way, We were actually going onto the back roads, even though there was no reason to do so. Clarissa was the one to speak up, and I think Gary told her that he knew this other route that was a bit shorter. We only had to go like a few miles, so I wasn't sure why taking another route would be necessary. Clarissa asked him about it again, and this time he told us the app said there was a bad accident on the main road back, and so he had to go another way. At this point, alarm bells were ringing, and even in our drunken state, we knew that something was wrong. Eventually, the man pulled to a stop in a super sketchy neighborhood where none of the houses had their lawns mowed, and they all looked run down. Nikki asked him why he stopped, and to that Gary told her that he had forgotten something and just needed to get it from his house real quick. At that point, we all agreed that we needed to get out of the car and run. The only problem was that we didn't know where we were, and we didn't want to go up to any of the houses nearby. Even so, when Gary opened his door, we opened ours and got out as quickly as we could. He started yelling and waved his hands, telling us to get back in his car. He actually put his hand on my shoulder, but I slapped him and he let go. Though we were 3 drunk women, we were still aware of what was going on, and I think he didn't want to take on all 3 of us at once. Gary actually got back in his car and sped away, leaving us stranded for the moment. We decided to just walk back the way we came, since we had passed a major intersection to get to this road. After about 30 minutes, we found our way back there, and thank God no one gave us trouble along the way. Clarissa started waving her hands to flag down a car, and eventually a kind elderly couple pulled over. Luckily, there was enough room for all 3 of us, and they drove us back to Nikki's apartment. The couple advised us to call the police and speak to someone at Uber, though for whatever reason we didn't want to. The next day, Nikki checked her app, and apparently Gary had deleted his account. We didn't know what we could or should do after that, so we just didn't do anything. That probably wasn't the best decision, as who knows if that man is still out there, giving rides under a different account. We just hope that he never tries anything with someone else. Story 3. Did you ever have a dream or a hallucination that you felt was real, even after you realized what it was? That was my experience driving for Lyft one summer, and it still creeps me out to this day. I go to the University of Illinois, and to help with my tuition, I decided to investigate ride-sharing apps. I signed up with Lyft, and had been using it for about a month when this happened to me, and to this day I'm not sure if it was real. For immediate context, it was a little after midnight, and I was considering calling it quits for the night. The Red Bull I drank was wearing off, and I was starting to get extremely tired. I was parked in a row of parking spots underneath my apartment building, waiting for another request to come in. Just as I was about to make myself unavailable, I got a notification that a guy named Alex had just requested a ride. He was less than a mile from where I was, so I decided to accept it. As I drove over, I couldn't help but feel a strange sensation. Obviously, I was tired, but this felt different somehow. Eventually, I saw Alex, who was standing a few feet behind the curb and looking right in my direction. Even though this location was close to where I lived, I didn't recognize it. We seemed to be near some kind of office park, but with houses on the other side of the street. As I rolled down the window, Alex greeted me really enthusiastically, and as he entered my car, he continued to talk very loudly. It was hard to understand exactly what he was trying to say. I know it sounds odd. I got the sense that he was having an inner monologue, but just saying it out loud in a loud voice. I managed to confirm the destination, which was only a short drive up the road. After I made sure that Alex was wearing his seatbelt, I started to drive forward. I think at that point, Alex was describing what he did for work, but I couldn't tell what exactly he did from his description. He told me that he had to move around boxes to sit down in a big chair, and then he left. And after that, he said he probably went in and out of the door 100 times each hour. It barely made any sense, and I figured he was on something. For some reason, he didn't seem dangerous to me, and his voice wasn't enough to make me want to pull over and stop the ride. After only a few minutes, we reached our destination, which was another office park/neighborhood area. Even before I asked, Alex got out of the car, all while continuing to talk very loudly. I'm not even sure he said thanks. He seemed to just continuing carrying on the same conversation. Now, the next thing I remember is looking around my car while I was back in my apartment building. I remember being confused and trying to remember how I got back. I didn't recall putting my address into my phone after I dropped Alex off. However, I was still very tired, so I made sure I was unavailable, walked up the stairs to my apartment, and then crashed in bed. I didn't have school the next day, and I woke up at like 11. I had been lacking sleep for a while, so I guess I just made up for it. Now, here's the weird part. The next time I decided to drive, I glanced over my driving history to see how active I'd been recently. When I did so, I didn't see Alex's name pop up. At first I thought it was a glitch, so I closed and reopened the app. but his name still wasn't there. I thought there still might have been some issue with the app, but after driving a few people and seeing their names pop up, I started to question what exactly happened. I now believe that my ride with Alex was a dream or a hallucination, caused by my being extremely tired and having recently drunk a Red Bull. I still consider that strange, since I've been in similar situations before, even while I had to work and do stuff, and I never had something even remotely similar to that happen. I've also never had a hallucination, at least as far as I know, and I don't sleepwalk or anything like that. Whether or not that was real, I decided to not drive again while I was that tired. So far, nothing else like that has ever happened.